So, here's an ugly little word that nobody really wants to talk about, not in any detail anyway. So I'll take a crack at it for a few minutes. The word is sin. If you're a Christian, at least nominally a Christian, you recognize and are willing to acknowledge that Jesus died on the cross for your sin. That's not a problem, right? The problem is when we start turning that word inward and want to apply it to ourselves specifically. In my experience, Christians are as good as anyone, and probably better than most, at rationalizing bad conduct and defending the sin in their life. There's a couple reasons for that, one of which we don't really have the courage to look in the mirror. The second is we dodge the need to agree with God in the Bible as to what sin looks like specifically. This isn't going to be a video on beating people over the head with the Ten Commandments. There's some practical reasons why we need to deal with the sin in our life. And the most direct and explicit statement, I believe, of the principle of why we need to deal with it on a practical level is in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19, where the apostle Peter tells us very clearly, we are enslaved by whatever controls us. A lot of people think that giving up certain things restricts their freedom. I would like to come at that exactly backwards and suggest to you that our inability to give up certain things is what restricts our freedom and entangles and enslaves us. We can all look around and find somebody that has worse problems than we do. It's easy to pick out an alcoholic, a drug addict. We might even know people that have died of drug overdoses, and we feel compassion for them because it's clear that they lost control of their lives. But sin's a lot more subtle than that. It controls all of us and influences all of us in ways that we don't always recognize, first of all, and secondly, we don't always want to acknowledge. The Bible tells us that sin is pleasant. It also tells us that sin is a passing pleasure. Its pleasures are temporary. Eve looked at the apple back in Genesis on the tree and saw that it was good to eat, and it looked good. So it tasted good going down, but then it hit her stomach and poisoned her, and sin entered the world, and Adam fell right along with her. I want to suggest that the influence of sin is subtle and filled with half-truths. For example, how many of us have certain compulsions and obsessions which drive us, which probably don't belong in our life because they're limiting us in other ways? What about the workaholic who has a career goal that says, I want to be a CEO of a major company by age 40, and sacrifices virtually everything in his way to achieve that goal, including his family, his marriage, his relationships, any real peace and contentment in his life while he pursues that obsession? What about the women obsessed with beauty, gorgeous at age 20, fighting to hold on to it at age 50? We know people like this. But what does it look like in your life and in my life, and how do we deal with it? First of all, it's important to recognize that sin and compulsive behavior and things that control us are subtle. Sometimes they masquerade as good things, like a good work ethic, which can get out of control. I think the first step in dealing with it, frankly, is courage. the courage to stop rationalizing, to take an honest look in the mirror and ask yourself, what parts of my life are out of control? What doesn't belong in my life? And do an honest evaluation between yourself and God, and compare what you see in the mirror with what you see in the Bible and what God has for us by way of peace, contentment, and freedom if we get rid of the junk that has influenced and controlled us for most of our lives. So that would be step one, and it takes courage to look in the mirror, to do an inventory, and to see yourself honestly, and to be willing to admit that there are certain things in your life that don't belong there. And you can deal with them sooner or later, and in my experience, sooner is virtually always better than later, and right now is best of all. The second thing that we can do is to recognize what I came to terms with a few years ago. Jesus died on the cross for our sin, if we're a Christian. We recognize that we can't save ourselves. It required His blood price to deal with our sin. And it was the power of the risen Christ being a perfect sacrifice for our sin, which enables us now to come back into a relationship with God and spend eternity in heaven rather than in a much worse place. So here's a question that I came to terms with only a few years ago. If I can't save myself, what in the world makes me think I can clean myself up? If it took the power of God to save me and to restore my relationship with God, does it not also take the power of God to rebuild my character and deal with the ongoing sin in my life? Once I recognized this, my life became a whole lot easier. So step one is to have the courage to look in the mirror and to do an honest inventory and say, these things no longer belong in my life if they ever did. Step two is, yes, we can say no to sin, and we have to resist it, but the key to really defeating it and getting untangled from the things that control us is actually surrender. If you're a Christian, you have the power of God residing in you. The Bible tells us repeatedly that we've received the Spirit of God once we're reconciled to God, and it's that Spirit, that power, which raised Christ from the dead, which is also available to us to defeat the things that don't belong in our lives. So the key then is to identify them and surrender them consistently in prayer to God and to persist in it. And if you do that with a sincere heart and persist in surrendering these things and asking God to remove them, there will come a day over time when either these things fade out or they're just broken out of your life, and you wake up one day and realize that the things that had controlled and influenced you are no longer there, because God is faithful to His Word. Now, if you're not a Christian, you've got a whole different set of problems. You're back to the idea of trying to clean yourself up, if you're even able to recognize some of the things that don't belong and stop rationalizing it. But let's say that you decide you want to stop drinking, or whatever your compulsive or controlling attitudes and issues are. I think you're stuck as a non-Christian with trying to struggle through that in your own self-discipline and your own strength. You're going to end up with a therapeutic remedy rather than true healing. That's where the 12-step programs have come in, where if I'm an alcoholic, I'll have an opportunity to get up at a meeting every week and say, my name is Bob, I'm an alcoholic. And 10 years from now, I'll still be at that meeting, if I live, saying, my name is Bob, I'm an alcoholic. These programs have value to keep people sober, to keep them away from certain behaviors, but they're therapeutic. They don't lead to genuine healing. If you're a Christian, you actually have the power of God residing within you, and I believe with all my heart that our ability to overcome the sin in our life resides in our courage to admit the sin in our life, to take it before God, surrender it, and stay at it. And once these things are removed, we find out that the things that offered us freedom and liberty at one point were actually traps to entangle us. And once they're removed by the power of God, we actually have the ability, and not just the ability, we have the nature and character to live a peaceful life of freedom, true freedom. So thank you for watching.